We're going to be working with some interesting concepts. Tangrams, we're starting off with this. And some of you may have worked with tangrams before. Those of you who are at home, maybe you have a tangram laying around someplace. Kids tend to work with them a lot. My first experience with tangrams was not when I was a kid. I was 26, I was in graduate school, and I was introduced to this by a guy I mentioned before, Paul Rand, who was one of my teachers. And it's kind of an interesting idea. Tangram is a geometric form, and it starts with a square, and it's divided into 7 pieces, 5 triangles, a diamond shape, and a parallelogram. And the idea is to move these shapes around and to create designs using these shapes. And it's a wonderful way to explore geometry, geometric forms, and also to think about compositional concepts like figure ground, which is really the idea that when you design something two-dimensionally, that you're thinking not just of the shapes themselves, the figures, but also the spaces between the shapes and the spaces around the shapes. So in typography, we refer to this as form and counterform. In drawing, we call it figure ground. In composition, we might call it positive and negative space. There are many different names for this. The important thing is that we're considering all aspects of a composition, from corner to corner, side to side, top to bottom, edge to edge. And so you can kind of see that from the diagram here how a tangram is constructed. It's a square. It's divided into these pieces. And the points that are very critical are the corners, obviously, but also these halfway points, here and here and here. This is halfway between this is halfway between that, this is halfway. So it's very, very mathematical, but very easy mathematical, and totally based on geometry. And as we go through these examples, we'll see these various expressions. And when I say an expression, I'm really talking about a way of thinking about the composition in kind of human terms. So stability and balance. So we might see something like this, where the pieces are locked together and they're all in alignment. Now, when we look at this, we're aware of the white space around this shape because it's very, very grouped. But we're also aware of the shape in the center, the white shape. Excuse me. And so the tangram itself is made up not just of the 7 pieces of the original square, but also the spaces beyond. And that's what we really think of when we talk about figure ground relationships, the relationships of all these forms together, because they all come together to make the composition. This is one of the most important ideas in visual composition, in two-dimensional design, three-dimensional design too, but here we're dealing with two-dimensional design. Now you notice the colors, primary colors. You learned this yesterday, red, yellow, and blue. So today, when you're working with tangrams, you're going to be interested not only in putting the shapes together, but also in putting colors together in interesting ways. And you can think about these colors and the color combinations perhaps using some of the palettes that you explored yesterday, but also just kind of going back to color theory, primary colors, secondary colors, complementary colors, the various color contrasts, contrasts of light and dark, contrasts of warm and cool, contrasts of vivid and dull, complementary contrasts as well. So here we have secondary colors, purple, green, and orange. Another expression of stability and structure. Here we have a kind of a monochromatic palette, all one hue, variations of light and dark. And visual hierarchy comes into play. That's another term we used when we were talking about some of the ideas yesterday. Look how this one shape, the parallelogram, really stands out as being different from everything else. And that has to do with contrast of light and dark. So you can use color contrast to create visual hierarchies. Yes?
Can you define visual hierarchy again?
Okay.
Please?
It's a good question. So we're talking about creating a visual structure, of an order in which we look at elements within the composition, parts of the composition, and directing the viewer's eye to those parts using contrast. So being aware of the various positions. Now the tangram is great because it offers us only these 7 shapes, but also the shapes in between, the figure and the ground. So it's kind of limited. You can't use any more, you can't use any less. The rules basically are the shapes don't overlap. It's okay to maybe bleed the shapes outside, but keep the shapes whole so we recognize them. Another expression of stability, but that means that stability doesn't necessarily mean locked to the edges or perfectly horizontal and vertical. So you can have an angled composition like this, where you might have a point here and a point down here that locks to the edges of the composition, but it still expresses this idea of structure, expressions of movement. This is one of the most interesting things. How can a static composition express movement? We can do that. Typically, with an expression of movement, there's some part of the composition that is very structural, yeah? And then other parts where the pieces seem to be moving or flowing away. So if you have part of the composition that feels very tight, structured to the edge, other elements that are not structured to the edge, there's a contrast. It's a compositional contrast. It's a great expression of movement. Also, contrast of large and small, another compositional contrast. So we have one element down here, and then the other elements are grouped at the top. Now notice how you can put these pieces together and actually form larger pieces, what we call compound shapes. So your compositions can be as simple as this: a background color, a foreground color, yeah? A figure color and a ground color. Now notice how the yellow plays against the red, very different from the black. The white is kind of similar to the yellow, yeah? So in a way, the black calls attention to itself differently than those other colors. So some of the ideas you're exploring. Another expression of movement. Now, when we're talking about figure ground, look at these red shapes in between the tangram shapes. They're very important, yeah? And so your design is dependent on all of these elements. Look at this little red triangle up here that exists between the black and the white. So those three shapes are framing this shape. These three shapes are framing this shape. These two shapes are framing that shape. So I want you to be aware of these as you're working with the tangram shapes. Another great expression of movement. Primary colors plus white and black. And then finally, symbolic expressions. Compositions that actually look like things that we can recognize. A person sitting down, perhaps reading something in a very sort of determined way. Over here, a structure of a chair, something like this, maybe a laptop or a computer. The head of this form is called out in red, so our eye really goes to that point. But the yellow is clearly the most important element here. Person sitting, the background is very dominant, right? Very, very powerful. But then you have all these other shapes that kind of move together. Puppy. So when we talk about symbolic expression, we're really thinking about an abstraction of something that we can recognize. You can do this on the computer. Christine's going to be working on the computer. And again, those of you at home, you can work with cut paper. You can work with the computer. Cut paper takes a little bit longer, so you have to cut out all the pieces. We've pre-done that, pre-finished that. So we have all these pieces cut out here on the table, and the students will be working with those in class. You'll be doing this on the computer. And actually, when you're working on the computer, feel free to apply some background effects. It doesn't have to be a solid form. Contrast of light and dark, yeah, within the background, from red to black. And finally, work hard to make the composition look simple, all right? Okay, keep in mind, and especially the audience at home, if you want to Google tangrams and do an image search, you'll see lots and lots of these things. People have been making tangrams forever. I think the history of the tangram goes back perhaps several thousand years. It's another Chinese invention. But you can also go to a toy store and buy these things. They're made out of wood. Very interesting. So I think we can get started. So I'm going to do a little demo. And maybe working on the computer might be a good idea first. Actually, I'll do it when paper. Come on to this side. So just starting with a board, and I'll push these things to the side for now. We have all these pre-cut shapes. Great, we have the overhead camera, fantastic.
Now, the program that Christine is going to use, Richard, is that Illustrator?
It is Illustrator.
Fantastic.
So it looks like each one of these little groupings is the 7 shapes. So there you see the 7 shapes. A square, a parallelogram, 2 small triangles, a middle-sized triangle, and then 2 large triangles. And the idea here is to put these shapes together in ways that express stability, movement, or are some kind of an abstraction. So you can choose which one of those 3 ideas you want to work with. And I'm just going to start pushing these around. Actually, since it's yellow, I might start with a black. Give me a little bit more contrast. You see how much contrast there is with the yellow against the black. And if I'm thinking about structure, maybe I'll start by locking one of these shapes to the edge. Begin to think about the spaces in between the shapes. And again, I want to emphasize the idea of play. I don't know what this is going to be. I'm just starting out. And I'm improvising as I go. Now I've made not a million of these things, but many. So I might have a slight advantage. But look at that. It's kind of, sometimes you get these little moments of serendipity. And if you see that, you definitely want to go with it. The shapes can touch or not touch. But like that kind of a relationship where there's an alignment of an angle is kind of interesting. Now I have this one other piece, but maybe I'll try a different color just to see what happens. And I'm going to go back to that small triangle. Keep in mind that you never want more than the 7 shapes. You always want to just work with those particular things. And then think about some kind of contrast. So as soon as I put that element in there, it starts to change the composition. But this is a good example of stability, structure. Again, kind of accidentally, I have this very strong central axis that runs right up the center, measured here to here. Things kind of floating off of that. Very aware of the figure and ground, the yellow forms, the red forms, and the black forms. I'm designing all of these things. Again, it's a good idea to take pictures along the way. It's a good expression of structure. If I'm thinking about movement, I can maybe work off of this. Parallelogram, there it is. So part of the composition has a very strong structure to it. Other parts of the composition don't. They're more free form. And of course, you can also express movement just by pushing all the pieces in some kind of an array or an arrangement where they're not locked at all into place. And there's a sense of kind of a dynamic energy to the composition because of that. Again, thinking about the spaces in between the shapes as well as the shapes themselves. Let's see what happens if I bring in another piece. I think this is right. No, it has to be the bigger piece. That's correct. Oh, yeah. Okay. So you see how different the expression of movement is from an expression of structure. Yeah? Does that make sense so far? Yeah? And then some kind of abstract symbolism. And the easy thing to start with is perhaps the human form. Again, if you do an image search, you'll see complete, almost like fonts of tangrams in different human forms, almost like Olympic symbols for runners and skaters. And you have these shapes that really kind of lend themselves very well to human forms, and maybe that was the original idea of the tangram, who knows? If you've ever seen the color forms box, which is something, again, we played with as kids, the logo looks like it was made out of tangrams. So when we get to, say, a human form, it can be very structural. It can express movement. It actually doesn't look like a human. Maybe a little bit more like a bird, something like that. Look at that black space on the inside. It's kind of interesting. And if you want to bleed off the edge, that's perfectly fine too. So the nice thing about this is that it gets very close to, say, symbols and logos. And actually, this is a great exercise. If you're designing a logo or a symbol, do something like this just as a warm-up, and it'll give you some ideas. It may not be the end thing that you end up with, the end design, but it'll get you places.